Many of you, I presume, have seen Breaking Bad. And that's a really good example of the incorporation, at least in part, or maybe the possession by the shadow from the Jungian perspective, right? Because you have this ordinary high school teacher who really thinks that he's an axe, and his family as well. You know, like your typical persona, roughly speaking. He's just a normal guy. But part of the reason that he's a normal guy is because he actually hasn't been put in abnormal circumstances, and then all of a sudden he is. And he has a genuine moral conundrum, right? He's going to die of lung cancer, and he has a son who's got a lot of health problems, and he's terrified that he's going to leave his wife and his child behind with nothing. And then, of course, has the story. And so he decides to do something that temporarily that he regards as what they would normally regard as reprehensible, and of course he just gets tangled up in that. But then as the story unfolds, you see that it's more complicated, because it's not that he was just innocent good guy and he decided to turn bad. He's also very resentful and angry, and it's partly because he's a bit of a pushover at the beginning, or maybe more than a bit of a pushover, and also that he didn't really fulfill his own potential, and that, you know, he had friends who walked down the entrepreneurial path, and maybe they weren't quite fair to him, but whatever, he ends up not very successful as a high school teacher. So he's really angry about that. And so there's more motivation for him opening up the door to the terrible elements of his personality than just the fact that he's got good motivations to do so. And that unfolds, you know. And so you see the warps and twists in his resentful character increasingly manifest themselves as he walks down this road to really total brutality. And it's quite good. There's a book called Ordinary Men that's a lot like that. I don't think I've mentioned that to you before, but Ordinary Men is a book about, it's the best book of its type. Maybe it's the only book of its type. It's possible, but it's plotted much like Breaking Bad in some sense. It's a story about these German policemen in early stages of World War II. And they were guys who were old enough to be raised in Germany really before the Hitlerian propaganda came out in full force. You know, if you were a teenager, say in the 1930s, you were going to be pulled right into the propaganda machine, and maybe you were part of the Hitler Youth, and like you were raised in that, you know. But if you were older, then you were raised before that, and you're not as amenable to propaganda once you're older than about, well, I would say about 22 or something like that. It's pretty young, actually. If you're going to make a soldier, you have to get a soldier young, because once people are in their early 20s, say, they already have their personality developed. Anyways, these policemen were sent into Poland after the Germans marched through. And, you know, it was wartime, and there was this hypothesis in Germany that the Jews in particular were operating as a fifth column and undermining the German war effort, because, of course, the Germans blamed the Jews and a variety of other people for actually setting up the conditions that made the war necessary. And so when the police were sent into Poland, they were also required to make peace, roughly speaking. And so they started out by rounding up all the Jewish men between 18 and 65 and gathering them in stadiums and then shipping them off on the trains. But that isn't where they ended. They ended in a very, very dark place. I mean, these guys were going out in the field with naked pregnant women and shooting them in the back of the head by the end of their training. And what's really interesting about that is that their commander told them that they could go home at any time. So this is not one of those examples of people following orders. And the reason they didn't, roughly speaking, there's many reasons, but one of the reasons they didn't is because they didn't think it was comradely, so to speak, to leave the guys they were working with to do all the dirty work and run off. You know, and that's really an interesting fact, you know, because in different circumstances, you wouldn't think about that as reprehensible, right? You'd think, well, that's part of teamwork and under rough circumstances, and that's at least in part how they viewed it. And they were also made physically ill multiple times, physically and psychologically ill by the things that they had to do, but they kept doing them anyways. So it's one step at a time, and that's the thing, is that you end up in very bad places one step at a time, so you've got to watch those steps. Anyways, Pinocchio has now decided, after his latest misadventure, to return to the proper pathway. He's off to school again. And he's still pretty naive, although perhaps not as much so as he was before. And so he decides that he's going to do things right. He's going to go get educated. He's going back to school. He's going to take the conventional route to discipline and be a good boy, roughly speaking. And so he's off to school, and the fox waylays him again. This is a really interesting scene. It took me quite a long time to unpack this too. And so the fox, first of all, starts out by acting like he's sympathetic again, sympathetic towards Pinocchio. And so he's empathetic, you could say. And so this is an interesting analysis of empathy. So what happens is the fox convinces Pinocchio through a variety of maneuvers that he's actually not feeling very well, that he's sick. He really convinces him that he's a victim. And one of the things, I had a graduate student named Maja Djikic who had worked with the UN in Bosnia, and she had toured some of the mass grave sites there. And we wrote a paper one time called "You Can Neither Remember Nor Forget What You Don't Understand." And it was a paper about the idea, for example, it was partly about the idea that we should never forget the Holocaust, and that the idea there is that, well, we should never forget it and we shouldn't repeat it. But the thing is, if you don't understand how those things come about, you can't really remember them, right? You think about them as a set of historical facts, but that's not the kind of remembering that actually makes any difference. You have to understand the causal pathways. You have to understand how a society would transform in that manner, and more importantly, you have to understand the role of the individuals within that society, unless you're going to assume that they're so completely unlike you that there's no connection whatsoever, in which case you haven't remembered it at all. You haven't learned anything at all, because the right lesson from what happened in the 20th century is this is what human beings are like. That's the correct lesson. And you can say, well, not me, but you should, but probably you too. That's the thing, probably. And probably me too, at least under normal circumstances. Anyways, the fox convinces Pinocchio that he's sick. He performs a lot of tricks to do this. Now, you could say that Pinocchio is susceptible to this because maybe there's still part of him that's looking for the easy way out. And so, one of the things that Maya and I found when we were writing this paper, we were looking at the discourse that precedes genocide in genocidal states, and the enhancement of a sense of victimization on the part of one of the groups, usually the group that's going to commit the genocide. First of all, their sense of being victims is much heightened by the demagogues who are trying to stir up this sort of hatred. So they basically say, look, you've been oppressed in a variety of ways, and these are the people who did it, and they're not going to stop doing it, and this time we're going to get them before they get us. It's something like that. And so there's something very pathological about the enhancement of victimization, which is, well, see, that the problem as far as I'm concerned with it is it's not thought through very well. Because there's a point that's being made, and the point is that people have been oppressed and they suffer. And that's true, that point. But then the proper framework from within which to interpret that, I believe, is that that's characteristic of life. You can't take it personally in some sense. And you can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims. And you certainly can't divide the world neatly into perpetrators and victims and then assume that you're only in the victim class and then assume that that gives you certain, like access to certain forms of redress, let's say. It gets dangerous very rapidly if you do that sort of thing. So, for example, one of the things that characterized the Soviet Union, and this was particularly true in the 1920s, but afterwards, so the Soviets were very much enamored of the idea of class guilt. So, for example, although it was only about 40 years previously that the serfs had been emancipated, they weren't much more than slaves, right? And so that was the bulk of the Russian population. They were bought and sold along with the land. So they had been emancipated, and some of them, many of them had turned into independent farmers, and some of them had become reasonably prosperous because, at least in principle, I presume a certain proportion of them from being crooked, but I presume a larger proportion from actually being able to raise food. And of course, at that time, the bulk of the Russian food population was produced by these relatively successful peasant farmers. And relatively successful would mean maybe they had a brick house or something, and maybe they had a couple of cows, and maybe they were able to hire a few people. And so, you know, it wasn't like they were massive landowners or anything.